I've tried to tell this story 3 times. Once to a colleague who was there. She stopped me halfway through and said she didn't want to know what happened on the 4th floor. Once to a therapist who was very good and very patient, and who eventually said, gently, that she thought I was telling myself a particular version of events that I might want to examine. And once to myself, in a parking garage at 2 in the morning, sitting in my car with the engine running, and I got about as far as the 2nd night before I had to stop. So this is the 4th time. I'm going to try to tell it the way it actually happened, in the order it actually happened, without the edits I keep making without realizing I'm making them. My name is Renata. I'm a respiratory therapist. I've worked hospital settings for 11 years. And I need you to understand that about me before anything else. The 11 years, the specific job, because what I did on the 2nd night was not something a frightened civilian did. It was something a trained clinician did, with full understanding of the variables, in a state of controlled and deliberate decision-making. That's the part I keep editing out. Let me put it back in. But first I need to tell you about the silence. Not the quiet we built, the one underneath it, the one that was already there when we arrived, pressing against the walls of the building like water against a dam. The one that, 11 months later, I heard again in a completely different hospital, 60 miles away. That's the part I haven't told anyone. Marcus had been in room 412 since Tuesday, routine appendectomy. He was 16. The surgery went fine, no complications, clean margins, the kind of case that gets discharged in 36 hours and leaves no particular impression on anyone. He was already eating soft foods by Tuesday evening. He'd been watching something on his phone with earbuds in when I came to check on him Tuesday night. And he'd pulled one earbud out and said, "Hey, Auntie Ray," in that particular teenage tone that is simultaneously affection and mild embarrassment. And I'd checked his O2 sat and his drain output and told him he looked good, and he said cool, and put the earbud back in. That was the last normal conversation I had inside that building. I need to tell you about Marcus and me, because the story doesn't work without it, and I've been avoiding it. I raised Marcus from when he was 9 until he was 12. His mother, my sister Dara, went through a period that I'm not going to detail here, and Marcus needed to be somewhere stable, and I was the stable option. 3 years. We built something during those 3 years, something real and functional and occasionally very funny. He learned to cook 2 things. I learned that he processed difficult emotions through extended silences that could last most of a day, followed by a single specific question that was actually about something else entirely. We got each other. Then Dara got better, and Marcus went back to her, and that was the right outcome. But the transition had edges, sharp ones, and some of those edges were still there 4 years later, in the way he said hey instead of hi, in the way I sometimes felt those 3 years hovering between us like something neither of us wanted to name. He trusted me, mostly, but there was this hesitation, like he was always doing a small, quick calculation about whether this version of me, this advice, this instruction, was coming from Auntie Ray or from the adult who had authority over him for a while and who he'd eventually been separated from. I understood the calculation. I'd have made it too. I'm telling you this because at hour 41, I needed him to do something without making that calculation, and he made it anyway, and I don't blame him. Okay. Wednesday morning, I came in for my 6 a.m. shift. The first thing I noticed was the elevator. Not what was in it, what wasn't. There was usually a transport aide on the morning shift who used the east elevator almost exclusively. You'd hear the cart, the squeak of one specific wheel. By the time I'd badged through the staff entrance and walked the internal corridor to the elevator bank, I'd normally have heard it at least once. That morning, nothing. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that isn't there when you expected it. A small cognitive snag. I filed it and moved on. The second thing was the nursing station on 3. I need to describe this carefully because it's easy to retrofit significance onto things you noticed before you understood them. So let me be precise. What I observed was 2 nurses at the station, both standing rather than sitting, both facing the hallway, both holding clipboards they weren't writing on. One of them, Jana, who I'd worked alongside for 6 years, looked at me when I came through the door and did something I'd never seen her do before. She held one finger up. Not one moment, not come here, just the finger, vertical, deliberate. And I stopped, because Jana's body language, everything below the neck, was communicating something that had no business existing at 6:15 on a Wednesday morning in a regional hospital. She was standing the way you stand when there's something in the room with you that you don't want to disturb. And then she mouthed something, and I read it wrong the first time, and she mouthed it again, more slowly, and what she was saying was, "Don't use the PA." I'm going to compress the next 2 hours because the details matter less than the texture. The texture was gradual recalibration. Nobody explained it to me in a single conversation. Nobody sat me down. What happened was more like walking into a room where the furniture has been moved. You don't need someone to tell you. Your body knows. You start adjusting your stride before your brain has articulated why. By 8 a.m., I understood the shape of it. Something had been encountered in the building, first in the basement level and then on the second floor, beginning sometime around 3 in the morning. 3 people had heard it before anyone understood the relevant variable. 2 of them were fine. One of them, a night shift orderly named Carl Benton, 34 years old, father of 2, was in the ICU. His prognosis was not something anyone had put into words yet, and I am not going to put it into words now either. The relevant variable took approximately 90 minutes to establish. What established it was this. A charge nurse named Phil Oduya had been in the supply room off the second-floor hallway when he heard something moving in the corridor. He'd frozen. He'd been holding a box of gauze. And the thing, whatever it was, however it moved, I am genuinely not going to become the person who describes it in clinical detail, because I don't know the clinical detail. I know what I saw, and what I saw was partial and in poor light. The thing had continued past the supply room doorway without stopping. Phil had stood motionless in that supply room for 11 minutes. He'd timed it on his watch. In those 11 minutes he hadn't made a sound, and nothing came back. The gauze box, when he finally set it down on a shelf, made a soft cardboard sound. Almost nothing. And something in the hallway paused. He'd held his breath. After a very long time, it moved on. That was the data point. That was what had been circulating through the building since approximately 4:30 in the morning, passed in handwriting and mouthed words and gestures and held eye contact. Not an explanation, not a protocol. Just the one thing that had been confirmed to matter, sound above a certain threshold. Nobody knew the threshold. That was the problem, or one of the problems. By 9 a.m., the building had changed. I want you to try to picture this specifically. because I think people hear hospital goes silent and they imagine something cinematic. Empty hallways, flickering lights, the aesthetic of crisis. That wasn't it. The building was still fully staffed. Patients were still in their rooms. The cafeteria was still open. People were still doing their jobs. But every hard surface had become something to manage. The nurses on 3 had already begun taping monitor leads against bed rails so they didn't rattle. Someone had gone through the east hallway with adhesive foam and affixed small pads to the insides of cabinet handles so the metal wouldn't catch when a door closed. The overhead PA system had been silenced. The control panel in the administrative office wrapped in a sheet of paper with 2 words written on it in block letters: "Do not." Staff were wearing their softest shoes, or had removed shoes entirely and were moving in socks. Clipboards were being used for everything, pointing, spelling with a finger on a palm. One of the hospitalists, a very tall man named Dr. Hess, who I'd always known to speak in the specific booming register of someone who has spent a career talking over ambient noise, was walking the corridors communicating entirely in written notes and hand gestures, and the adjustment on his face was the most disturbing thing I'd seen yet. Not because he was frightened, because he was adapting, because he was already good at it. We were all already getting good at it, and I hadn't checked on Marcus yet. Room 412. I knocked lightly, 4 raps, habit, and the door swung inward, and Marcus looked up from his phone and opened his mouth, and I held both hands up and shook my head, and he looked at me for 1 long second with an expression I couldn't fully read, and then he looked at my face more carefully, and he closed his mouth. He was 16, and he'd had surgery 2 days ago, and he read my face, and he closed his mouth without being told why. That moment, the speed of it, how quickly he understood that something was wrong, how completely he trusted the information on my face before I'd given him any actual information. That was the Marcus from those 3 years, the kid who'd learned to read me in a house where neither of us ever quite said the difficult thing directly. I closed the door, gently. I caught it 3 inches from the frame and brought it the rest of the way by hand, feeling for the latch, guiding it home without a click. I sat on the edge of his bed and I wrote on his whiteboard, the discharge notes whiteboard every patient room has, with the dry erase marker still attached by a string. And I wrote, "Something is in the building. It reacts to sound. I need you to be very quiet. I will explain when I can." He read it. He looked at me. He wrote under it, in his own handwriting, "What kind of something?" I wrote, "I don't know exactly." He looked at me again. The calculation. I watched it happen. Then he wrote, "Okay." And then after a pause, he erased "okay" and wrote, "How bad?" And I wrote, "Bad enough that I'm here instead of my floor." He nodded. He put his phone face down on the bedside table, reached over and manually lowered the volume on the TV to 0, and settled back against his pillow. He moved carefully, still sore, still protecting the incision site, and he didn't make a sound. I sat with him for 4 minutes. Then I went back to work. I'm going to tell you about the cough. This was hour 6, approximately noon. The woman in 408, 4 doors from Marcus, had been admitted for a pulmonary embolism 2 days before any of this started. She was 61, stable, on anticoagulants. Her name was Mrs. Garland, and she had a daughter who'd been calling the nursing station approximately every 40 minutes before the PA went down. And I don't know what happened with those calls during the crisis, because the front desk was operating on its own modified system by then. What I know is that at noon on Wednesday, Mrs. Garland's body decided it needed to cough. The human cough, I'm a respiratory therapist, I've measured this, can reach 90 decibels. A quiet, suppressed cough is still 60. Normal conversation is 60. A whisper is 30. We did not know the threshold. I was in the hallway when I heard it start. That preliminary tightening, if you know what a cough sounds like in the moment before it happens. There's a distinct preparatory sound, a kind of retraction, and I was moving before I had a conscious thought about it, through the door, across the room. Mrs. Garland had both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were wide and wet, and she was fighting it with everything she had. I could see the effort in her throat, the rigid set of her jaw. But the body has its own logic, and a cough that needs to happen will happen. I pressed my palm flat against her sternum. Not hard, just present, grounding pressure. It's a technique for cough suppression, legitimate clinical practice, and I used it, and I leaned close to her and I mouthed. Slow breath in. Her eyes found mine. Slow breath in. She breathed in, carefully, controlled. The cough retreated, not gone, deferred, and she held the breath for 3 seconds and let it out through her nose. Slow, and her whole body was shaking with the effort of it. And I kept my palm on her sternum and watched her, and did not look at the door. We did that 4 times. On the 5th breath, the cough subsided. She was crying, silently, tears running. She reached up and covered my hand with hers, and I nodded at her. And I could feel her pulse in her palm, elevated, the body's terror of its own involuntary noise. We stayed like that for a while. When I finally looked at the door, there was a nurse in the hallway, one of the floor nurses. I didn't know her well, and she was standing very still against the wall with her back pressed flat to it, and she was looking at the ceiling, and she was doing the kind of controlled breathing that is not about calmness. It is about making yourself as small as possible in every dimension, including sound. Nothing came. Eventually, we started breathing normally again. Normally. Like that was still a word that meant something. Hour 9. The oxygen concentrator in room 406 had a fault alarm. Oxygen concentrators run continuously, and they have internal fault detection. And when the fault detection trips, the alarm is automatic, and it is loud, and it is designed to be loud because the whole point is to alert staff that a patient's oxygen delivery may be compromised. The alarm was designed to be impossible to miss. At hour 9, impossible to miss had become impossible to allow. I was the one closest to 406 when it started. A single preparatory chirp, the system warming up to full alert, and I was through the door, and my hand was on the alarm panel, and I was doing something I want to be precise about. I was manually interrupting an oxygen delivery alarm on a live patient. The patient in 406 was a 67-year-old man named Mr. Adesanya, who had moderate COPD and genuinely needed supplemental oxygen, and was asleep when I came in, and I crossed the room in 4 steps and silenced the alarm by holding the manual override while simultaneously checking the concentrator's actual output reading, which was 94%. Equipment fault, not delivery fault. The concentrator was throwing an error but still running. He was fine. He was fine, and I had silenced his alarm before verifying that, and I want to sit with that for a moment because I think that moment is when the ethical math in my head started running on a different set of assumptions. Not wrong assumptions, not yet, just different ones. The alarm had made 1 chirp, 1 preparatory chirp, nothing came, but I had started making a new kind of calculation, a faster one. A calculation where the noise this equipment makes got weighted against the cost of that noise, and where verify then silence sometimes lost to silence then verify. I was very good at that calculation by hour 12. I am still not sure whether that is something to be proud of. Hour 12, the oxygen tank. I have to tell this carefully. One of the newer orderlies, I didn't know him well. I think he'd been at the hospital maybe 4 months, was moving supplies through the third-floor corridor. This had become a different kind of task than it used to be. Every item evaluated, every surface route planned, every metal-on-metal contact mapped and managed. He'd been doing well. I'd watched him work, and he was careful, deliberate, the kind of careful that looks almost too slow, until you understand why. The tank wasn't secured properly in the transport cart. I don't think it matters whose mistake it was. The tank shifted. There's a half-second between the moment a heavy object begins to fall and the moment it lands, and in that half-second, the entire hallway, every person in it, at least 6 of us, went completely still, in a way that the human body doesn't go still normally. In the way that a prey animal goes still. Every one of us, simultaneously, without any of us making a decision about it. The tank hit the floor, linoleum over concrete subfloor. The sound was a hard, metallic, concussive impact, sharp and round at the same time, and it rang in the corridor like a struck bell, and the echo went down the hallway toward the east stairwell, and kept going. And then silence, real silence. Not the managed quiet we'd built, something underneath it, something that had been underneath it the whole time, and we just hadn't heard it because we'd been too busy managing the surface. Nobody moved. I don't know how long we stood there. The brain's time perception distorts severely under acute threat response. What I experienced subjectively was a very long time, long enough to observe in crisp detail the faces of 5 people who were each privately running the same calculation, the same question, without any of them being willing to look directly at anyone else. Did that call it? The tank had rolled slightly and come to rest against the baseboard. Somewhere down the corridor, far, maybe the south stairwell, maybe further, something moved. Not a standard building sound. Not pipes or ventilation or settling. A sound that had weight behind it. A sound that had direction. It moved once, then stopped. Nobody breathed. Then another sound, closer. The same weight, the same direction. 1 floor down, maybe, or in the stairwell itself. The sound of something large adjusting its position with the kind of patience that is not about hesitation. It is about attention. One of the nurses, I don't know her name, I wish I did, bent very slowly and picked up the tank and set it upright and placed it back in the cart with both hands, like she was placing a sleeping child in a crib, and straightened and stood still again. We waited. The second sound did not repeat. After a long time, long enough that my legs ached and my left hand had gone numb from how hard I'd been pressing it against the wall, people began moving again, one at a time, in the direction they had each been going. Slower than before. The orderly with the cart stood in place a little longer than everyone else. When I passed him, his eyes were wet. I put my hand briefly on his arm. We didn't stop walking. I need to tell you about what happened at hour 14. This is where the title comes from, and I've been putting this off. The maternity ward is on the 6th floor. Ridgemont General is a full-service regional hospital. There were 3 women in active labor on Wednesday morning, and by the time the building had gone quiet, none of them had delivered yet. Labor makes sound. I know how that sounds, stated flatly like that. But it is the reductive truth of the situation we were in. The physiological process of labor at its most controlled, with the best epidural, with the most compliant patient, involves involuntary vocalization. The body in that much effort, under that much pressure, makes noise. We knew this. Everyone knew this. And the conversation that happened on the 6th floor, I was not part of it, but I was told about it later in pieces, by people who were, was approximately the most terrible conversation that occurred in that building during those 72 hours. Which is saying something. The decision that was made, and I want to be fair to the people who made it, because they were making it with no good options, was the 6th floor stays isolated. Staff who were already up there stay. No one moves between floors unless absolutely necessary. The 6th floor manages its situation, and the rest of the building manages its situation, and those two situations are kept as separate as possible. The laboring women were not told the full reason. They were told there was a building situation, and to please try to be as quiet as possible. I understand why that was the language that was used. I also understand what it would have felt like to be one of those women in that moment. The number 14, that's how many people in total I was responsible for, between my own patients and the overflow from other floors. 14, a manageable number, ordinarily. By hour 14, I had stopped counting. Not because I lost count, because counting had started to feel like something I couldn't afford, something that might make me calculate too explicitly, something that might make me honest about which lives I was weighing against which other lives. We stop counting at 14 because after 14 the math becomes something you can't carry and still do the work. Hour 18. I need to tell you this part because I haven't told anyone, and because it's the part that made the second night possible. Not emotionally, mechanically. It's the part that proved the thing was real. I was in the 4th floor corridor, between 406 and 408, walking toward the supply closet. It was late, well past dark. Most of the patients were either sleeping or pretending to. The hallway was lit by every other overhead fluorescent, the alternating ones switched off to reduce the hum of the ballasts, and the effect was a repeating pattern of light and shadow, running the length of the corridor like piano keys. I heard it. Not from the stairwell, not from below, from the other end of the hallway, my hallway, the 4th floor. I stopped walking. It was not a sound I can compare to anything biological. It was not footsteps. It was not breathing. It was a kind of displacement, as if something very large was moving through a space that was almost but not quite large enough to contain it, and the air was being pushed aside, and the push was what I could hear. A low, rhythmic compression, like the building itself was making room. It was coming from the east end of the corridor, moving west, toward me. I did not move. I did not breathe. I was standing between two pools of fluorescent light, in the shadow, and some part of my brain, some part that was not the clinician, not the adjuster, not the rational woman who had built 40 hours of protocol on evidence and procedure. That part said, the shadow is better. Stay in the shadow. The compression moved closer. I could feel it in my sinuses, in my inner ear, the way you feel a change in altitude, a pressure that wasn't air pressure, but behaved like it. Room by room, it was coming down the hall. 404, 406, 408. It passed within 15 feet of me. I did not see it. I want to be clear about that. The lights were on. The hallway was visible. I was looking directly at the space where the sound was coming from, and I did not see anything. But the light was wrong. Where the compression was, the fluorescent light didn't behave normally. It didn't flicker, it didn't dim, it bent slightly, like heat haze above asphalt in summer, a gentle visual distortion, about 7 feet tall, moving at the speed of a slow walk. It continued past me, past 410, toward 412. Marcus. I stopped breathing. I stopped thinking. I became something very simple and very old, a body that needed to stay absolutely still, because moving was death. And I stood in that hallway, and I watched the distortion pass 410 and approach 412. And I could not warn him, because warning him would make sound, and sound was the variable, and the variable was the thing I had built my entire framework around. It reached 412. It paused. The pause lasted approximately 4 seconds. I know because I was counting heartbeats, which is a clinical habit, and was at that moment the only thing between me and total collapse. 4 seconds. Then it moved on, past 412, past 414, toward the west stairwell. It was gone. I stayed motionless for another full minute. Then I walked on shaking legs to 412 and opened the door 1 inch and looked through. Marcus was asleep. His monitor was dark. His drain was secure. His face was relaxed. He hadn't heard anything. I closed the door. I pressed my forehead against it. I pressed it there for a long time. Then I went back to work. Hour 19. Marcus. I'd been checking in every hour or so. Whiteboard messages, quick assessments, making sure his drain was clear and his vitals were manageable. He'd been remarkable. Quiet in a way that wasn't frightened. Or not only frightened, more like concentrated. He had a stillness that I recognized from when he was 10, 11, when things were hard at home and he'd learned to conserve himself. At hour 19, I came in, and he was awake and he pointed at the whiteboard. He'd written something while I was gone. Several lines, small handwriting, using both sides of the whiteboard's surface. Is it like an animal? And below that, is it still in the building? And below that, the one that caught me. Are you okay? I stood at the whiteboard for a moment. I picked up the marker. I wrote, "We don't know what it is. Yes, still in the building. I'm functioning." He read that. He looked at me. He picked up the marker and crossed out, "I'm functioning," and wrote, "That's not what I asked," and handed me the marker and looked at me with an expression that was not 16 years old. Or not only 16 years old. I stood there. For a moment, I wrote, "No, but I'm working." He nodded. He took the marker back and wrote, very small, at the bottom, "I know. That's the same thing with you." I erased the board. I checked his vitals. I left. In the hallway, I stood with my back against the wall for 30 seconds. Just stood, breathing. Then I went back to work. Hour 22. Mrs. Garland coughed, not the controlled suppression from noon. A real cough. She was asleep, and her body bypassed every conscious system she'd been using to hold it down, and she coughed twice, hard, raw, the sound punching through the hallway like a hand clap in a cathedral. And from the stairwell, the west stairwell, the one the distortion had moved toward 3 hours ago. A response. Not a sound, exactly. A vibration. The kind of thing you feel in the floor before you hear with your ears, like something very heavy shifting its weight 1 floor below. Like something that had been still, listening for a long time, and had just been given a reason to move. Every person in that hallway made the same face. The face of someone who has been holding something back for 22 hours, and has just been reminded that the thing they're holding back from is not a concept. It is in the building. It is 1 floor away, and it heard that. The vibration did not repeat. Mrs. Garland woke up and pressed both hands over her mouth, and her eyes found the nearest nurse, and the nurse was already in the doorway, already shaking her head very slowly, already placing a finger against her own lips. And Mrs. Garland understood, and she lay there with both hands clamped over her face, breathing through her fingers, her whole body rigid with the effort of containing itself. Nothing came. Not then. Hour 38. I need to tell you about the woman with dementia. Room 401. Her name was Ruth Espinoza, and she was 83 years old, and she had moderate to severe dementia of the Alzheimer's type, and she had been in the hospital for a hip fracture that had been repaired 6 days ago and was healing cleanly. Ruth called for her husband. His name, I learned from her chart, was Bernard. He had died 11 years ago. She called for him periodically, not constantly, in waves, the way dementia often works. 15-20 minutes of quiet, and then, Bernard, Bernard, are you there? Bernard, I need you to come here. This had begun on the first night of her admission. Before any of this, it was part of her pattern. It was documented, managed, responded to with gentle redirection by the night staff. At hour 38, the night staff had been managing it for 18 hours. I want to tell you what that looks like, because I think people hear dementia patient calls for deceased husband, and they feel the sadness of it, and that sadness is real and appropriate. But I want you to understand the operational reality. Every call was a potential draw. Every Bernard carried down a hallway was a decibel count that none of us could calculate against a threshold none of us knew. The sedation question had been raised and answered. Ruth had a documented adverse reaction to 2 of the most commonly used sedatives, and the third option required physician authorization and IV access, and a level of monitoring that would have required continuous staff presence in her room. The physician on call had reviewed the chart by flashlight and made the determination that sedation risk outweighed the benefit. So Ruth called for Bernard, and the staff caught each call as quickly as they could and redirected, and I did the same when I was on that section of the floor. Mrs. Espinoza, it's Renata. I'm right here. Bernard isn't here right now, but I'm here. You're okay. You're in the hospital. You're safe. She would settle. For 15 minutes. 20. And then, Bernard. Bernard, are you there? At hour 38, I sat with her for a while. She looked at me in the particular way of someone who is not sure whether what they see is real, and she said very quietly, which was its own kind of mercy, "Are you the woman from the church?" And I said as softly as I could, "Yes, I'm from the church." And she nodded like that explained things, and she lay back. And for a little while, she was quiet. I held her hand. I thought about Bernard, who I had never met, and who had been dead for 11 years, and I thought about the particular cruelty of a mind that keeps returning to the people it loves when those people are gone. And I held her hand, and I watched the doorway. Hour 40. Marcus's drainage tube needed to be checked and the output logged, and I had been putting it off because every time I went into his room, I had to leave again, and each time I left was harder. He was awake. He was always awake when I came in. I don't know if he was sleeping when I wasn't there, but every time I came in, he was awake and watching the door, and I understood what that meant. I checked the drain. Output was fine, actually better than expected. I logged it on his paper chart because we'd moved to paper everywhere by now. He was watching me work. He wrote on the whiteboard, "How many more hours?" I wrote, "I don't know." He wrote, "Anti-Ray." I wrote, "I genuinely don't know." "I'm sorry." He sat with that. Then he wrote, "Are the other patients okay?" The honest answer was no, not all of them. There had been 2 incidents on the 2nd floor during the night that I'd been told about in handwriting, that someone had then folded up and put in their pocket, and the ICU census had changed in ways I was not going to write on a whiteboard in a 16-year-old's room. I wrote, "Most of them?" He looked at me. He wrote, "That's an anti-Ray answer." I wrote, "Yes." He wrote, "I want the other one." I thought about it. I actually thought about whether to write it out, the real numbers, the real situation, what I actually knew versus what I was inferring. I wrote, "It's been a bad 2 days. I don't think it's over. I don't know when it will be over. I'm going to keep doing my job until it is." He read it. He nodded. He didn't write anything back for a while. Then he wrote, "Is my mom okay?" I hadn't talked to Dara in 31 hours. The last I'd heard, she was home. The incident was being contained to the hospital campus. No external spread that anyone had confirmed. She was probably fine. Probably. I wrote, "Yes." He nodded. I took the marker and wrote one more thing, and then I held the board up so he could read it, and then I erased it. What I wrote was, "I'm glad you're here. I know that's a strange thing to say. I mean, I'm glad you're here with me specifically. I'm glad I know where you are." He read it. He looked at me. He held out his hand. I took it. I held it for a few seconds. Then I let go and went back to work. Hour 41. I have been building to this. I've been building to this since the beginning of this account, and I've been using the building to show you who I was in those 40 hours, how I thought, how I made decisions, how the math worked in my head, because I need you to understand the decision at hour 41, not as the action of a frightened person, but as the action of a trained clinician operating at the end of 41 hours of crisis management, using the exact same cognitive framework that had kept 14 people alive and quiet and undetected. I need you to understand that, because I need you to understand that the framework was sound. The application of it was defensible. The outcome was not something I could have fully predicted. And I need you to understand all of that before I tell you that I am not sure, even now, whether I made the right choice. Here is what happened. The man in 403 was named David Cho. He was 52 years old. He was post-cardiac procedure, a coronary catheterization, 2 days before the incident. He was recovering well. He had been one of the quieter patients on the floor. I barely had cause to think about him. At hour 41, his arterial line began to fail. An arterial line is a catheter placed directly into an artery, in his case the radial artery at the wrist, and it serves 2 functions: continuous blood pressure monitoring and repeated blood sampling without repeated needle sticks. When it fails, when the pressure reading drops, when the waveform goes flat, the monitor alarms, or it would have alarmed. I was in the hallway when I saw the monitor light change through the glass panel beside his door. I went in before the sound could initiate. I silenced the alarm panel before it completed a cycle. I checked his line. The catheter had partially dislodged. Not a crisis, this is a manageable clinical event. But it required intervention, either resecuring the line or removing it and converting to manual blood pressure cuffs and scheduled blood draws. The correct clinical intervention under normal circumstances is to replace the line. Replacing the line requires the patient's cooperation. It involves cleaning the site, repositioning, reattaching, potentially infiltrating local anesthetic if the patient is in discomfort. It is not silent, not the equipment, not the patient. I assessed David Cho. He was awake and alert, and looking at me with the particular lucid attention of someone who has been a patient long enough to read clinical faces. I had a conversation with him entirely on paper in about 90 seconds. Your arterial line has come loose. I need to address it. He wrote, "What are my options?" I wrote 2 options, the line replacement and the conversion to manual monitoring. The line replacement was clinically preferable. Better data, more responsive, appropriate for a patient 2 days out from a cardiac procedure. The conversion was quieter, significantly quieter. Blood pressure cuffs and scheduled draws involve known manageable sounds. The cuff cycling is soft. The Velcro is brief. I could time the cycling. He looked at both options. He was an intelligent man, a thorough reader of information. I could see him processing. He wrote, "Which do you recommend?" I wrote, "The first option is clinically superior." He wrote, "But?" And I held the pen, and the 41 hours sat on my shoulders, and Marcus was in 412, and Ruth was in 401 calling for Bernard, and Mrs. Garland was in 408 with a cough that could be deferred but not permanently, and I had the total acoustic load of the floor in my head like a map, and I looked at this man, and I thought, I cannot manage another variable. I wrote, "But given current conditions, I recommend option 2. He looked at me for a long time. He wrote, "How much worse is option 2 for me clinically?" And I wrote, and this is the part. I wrote, "Manageable, manageable, 11-year word, honest within a framework, true as far as it went." He trusted me. He wrote, "Okay, do option 2. He was fine. I want to say that clearly, immediately, before I continue. David Cho was discharged 8 days later with no complications attributable to that decision. His cardiac recovery proceeded normally. The manual monitoring was adequate. He was fine. But here is what I did not write on that paper. I did not write that the monitoring gap created by converting to manual cuffs would mean I was less likely to catch an acute event in the window between scheduled checks. I did not write that for a patient 48 hours out from a coronary procedure, the arterial line wasn't just convenient. It was the difference between catching a restenosis event at minute 1 and catching it at minute 20, when I happened to come back. I did not write that I was recommending the option that was quieter, not the option that was safer, and that I was using the word manageable to paper over that distinction. He trusted me to be his clinician. I was his clinician and his safety coordinator and the person keeping 14 people quiet in a hallway. And in the moment when those roles came apart, when what the clinician would do and what the safety coordinator would do were different things, I chose. He was fine. He was fine. And I have thought about that decision every day for a period of time that I am not going to disclose. And I have turned it over in exactly the way you turn something over when you are looking for the angle at which it stops being what it is. I haven't found that angle. He was fine. I was not the same thing. Hour 43. I heard her before I reached the doorway of 401, Ruth Espinoza. "Bernard. Bernard, I need you. Bernard, are you there?" Not loud. Ruth's voice had the particular flatness of advanced dementia, a voice that has lost its pitch modulation, its urgency. She called for Bernard with the same even tone in which she might ask for a glass of water, but in a corridor that had been managed to 30 decibels for 2 days, her voice carried. I went in. She looked at me. She looked uncertain. I sat on the edge of the bed. I took her hand. I said as quietly as I could manage, mouth almost closed, "It's Renata, from the church. I'm here." She looked at my face, processing. "Bernard," she said, quieter, but a word. And I felt the whole hallway shift, the way you feel everyone behind you go still without turning around to look. I held her hand. I put my other hand on her face, gently, palm to cheek, the way you'd hold the face of someone you were trying to bring back from somewhere far away. I said, "He's not here tonight. Bernard, he'll come tomorrow." She looked at me. Her eyes were not entirely in the room. I sat with her. I stayed in physical contact, and I kept talking, low and slow. And gradually, over the course of about 5 minutes, the name stopped coming. She held my hand, and she was somewhere else in her head, somewhere with Bernard, somewhere the hospital was not, and I sat with her until her eyes closed. Then I sat for another 2 minutes. Then I went back to the hallway. Philoduya was outside. He'd moved to the 4th floor sometime during the 2nd day, coordinating between sections. He looked at me. I looked at him. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder and let it drop. We didn't write anything down. Hour 51. The laboring women had all delivered. I learned this from a note passed down through 3 people, handwritten on a torn piece of patient intake form. All 3 deliveries, no fatalities, no attributable incidents. I don't know what that cost the people on the 6th floor. I hope someday someone who was there writes it down. Hour 68. Something changed. I don't know how to describe this scientifically, and I've stopped trying to. What I can describe is a gradual easing of a pressure that I had stopped noticing because I'd been inside it continuously for almost 3 days. The way you don't notice the headache until it lifts. The building felt different, still quiet, still managed. But the quality of the silence changed, less like held breath and more like exhaled breath. Phil came to find me at hour 68 and he wrote on a notepad, "East wing clear, 2nd floor clear, 3 incidents total, no additional, no additional." I read that 3 times. Then I wrote back, "Do we know why?" He shook his head. "We still don't know why. We know it was gone, the way you know a fever broke. Not because you understand the biology, just because the temperature changed and the night felt different. It was in the building, and then it wasn't. We had theories. I'm not going to repeat them here because theories about something you don't understand are just stories you tell yourself so the space isn't empty. It was gone. And that's when the thing I'd been suspending, all the things I'd been suspending, came down. I went to Marcus's room. He was asleep. Actually asleep, finally. His face relaxed in the way it hadn't been since Wednesday morning. His chart clipped to the bed rail with his vitals logging normally. The drain output good, his color good, every clinical indicator saying, he is fine. He came through this fine. I stood in the doorway and I looked at him for a while. Then I went and sat in the family lounge at the end of the 4th floor corridor. Beige chairs, a table with old magazines, a window with the blinds mostly closed. I sat in one of the chairs. I thought about David Cho's arterial line. I thought about the conversation on paper, the 2 options, the word manageable. I thought about the 41 hours that had made that the word I chose. I thought about the clinical math, the acoustic load, the way I'd been adding and subtracting variables for 3 days until the variables stopped being patients and became weights, factors, things to be balanced. I thought about whether there is a version of that conversation in which I make a different choice. I've run it a lot of times. There's a version in the first 12 hours before the calculation became instinct, where I replace the line and manage the noise, and it's a hard 10 minutes, and then it's done. There's probably a version of that. At hour 41, I'm not sure that version exists. At hour 41, I was operating on a set of assumptions that had been built and reinforced and proven over 60 consecutive decisions. And when I looked at that man, and I wrote manageable, I was telling the truth as I understood it inside that framework. The framework was wrong about some things. The framework was also the thing that kept everyone alive. I've been trying for a long time to separate those two facts. I'm not sure they separate. Marcus was discharged 2 days later. Dara came to get him. She hugged him for a long time in the discharge bay, and then she hugged me, which was unexpected, and then she held onto my arm and said, "Thank you for being here." I said, "He did all the hard work." She looked at me. She has known me my whole life, and she has always been able to tell when I'm performing fine. She said, "What happened in there?" And I said, "A lot. I'll tell you about it sometime." I haven't yet. Marcus was moving toward the car, slowly, carefully, still protective of the incision site, and he stopped and turned around and looked at me, and I looked back, and he said out loud, using actual words, his normal voice, "Thank you, Auntie Ray." And I nodded. And I didn't say anything because I didn't trust my voice in that moment, and because some things are too large to put inside normal language. He got in the car. I stood in the discharge bay until they turned the corner. Then I stood there for a little while longer. I went back inside. I went back to my floor. I picked up my patient load, new patients, different patients, people who had come through intake after the crisis period and were now simply patients in need of respiratory care. I did my job. I do my job every day. Sometimes, in the middle of a procedure, when I'm adjusting a ventilator setting or checking an alarm or logging an output number, I'll be in the middle of doing something completely ordinary and I'll become aware of the sound in the room, the specific decibel level of it, the quality of it, whether it's above or below something I still don't have a name for. I'll be standing in a hospital room doing a clinical task I've done 11,000 times, and I'll be cataloging every sound in the space, and I won't stop doing it because I'm afraid. I'll stop when the task is done, and then I'll go to the next room, and I'll do it again. I don't have a lesson for you. I've looked for one, and I keep finding the same thing instead. A woman at a whiteboard in a patient room, holding a dry erase marker, choosing one word instead of another word, and the word she chose was defensible and true within its framework and carried a cost that she is still paying, quietly, inside a job she's still good at, in a building that looks exactly the way it always looked. That building, Ridgemont General. 4th floor, room 412. I walked those corridors for 4 more months after the incident. Same job, same patients, same hallways. Then I transferred, not because of what happened, because of a better offer, better hours, a hospital closer to where Dara and Marcus had moved. A practical decision, the kind I'm good at. The new hospital is called St. Adeline's. 60 miles east, different building, different staff, different architecture. Bigger, newer. The hallways are wider. The floors are different material. Nothing about it looks or sounds like Ridgemont. I've been here 11 months, Last Thursday, I was on a night shift, 3rd floor, respiratory unit, routine rounds. The building was quiet the way hospitals get quiet at 3 in the morning. That particular institutional hush. Normal. I've worked in it 1,000 times. I was between rooms, in the corridor, writing a chart note in a doorway, and I stopped writing. I stopped because the quality of the silence had changed. Not the volume, the quality. There's a difference between a building that is quiet because people are sleeping and a building that is quiet because something in it is listening. The first silence has texture, ventilation, distant monitors, the soft percussion of a hospital at rest. The second silence is smooth, seamless, like a surface that has been deliberately cleared. I stood in that corridor, and I felt it. The same pressure, the same held breath quality, the same vast, attentive emptiness that I had learned to work inside at Ridgemont for 72 hours. I put down my pen. I put down my clipboard. I walked to the nursing station. I found a whiteboard marker in the supply drawer. I held it in my hand, and I stood very still, and I listened. And I thought, no. And I thought, it can't be. And I thought, this is a different building, a different city, a different everything. And then I thought about Phil Oduya, standing in a supply room, timing 11 minutes on his watch. I thought about the foam pads on the cabinet handles. I thought about Dr. Hess communicating in hand gestures. I thought about the nurse picking up the oxygen tank like a sleeping child. I thought about Mrs. Garland's 5 controlled breaths, and Ruth calling for Bernard and Marcus closing his mouth before I said a word. And I thought about how quickly all of us had adapted, how good we'd been at it, how the whole building had rebuilt itself around the silence in a matter of hours, like it was something we already knew how to do, like it was something the building already knew how to ask for. I stood at the nursing station, holding a dry erase marker at 3 in the morning, and I listened to the silence at St. Adeline's. It held for about 40 seconds. Then the ventilation cycled on and a monitor beeped in room 304, and the night shift texture came back, and the silence was just silence again. And I put the marker down, and I picked up my clipboard, and I went back to work. But I kept the marker in my pocket. I've kept one in my pocket every shift since. The horror, if you need me to locate it, is not the thing in the building. The horror is the 41 hours of rational decision-making that produced one quiet word on a whiteboard. The horror is that the framework worked. The horror is that I'd probably use it again. And the part I haven't said out loud yet, the part I keep reaching for and pulling back from, is this. I don't think it was one building. I think it's in the architecture, in the bones of certain structures, in the particular silence that large buildings hold inside themselves at night, under the ventilation, under the monitors, under the soft institutional hum that we've all agreed is just the sound a building makes. I think some buildings are quiet because they're empty, and I think some buildings are quiet because they learned to be. And I think the marker in my pocket is not a souvenir. It's a tool, and one of these nights, I'm going to need it again.